Life Stories invites you to explore the transformative power of kindness and connection. In today's story, we follow Nathan, a man who has spent years living in the shadows, unseen and unknown. But one small act of compassion from Riley, a local barber, sparks a journey Nathan never expected, a journey of self-discovery, courage, and hope. It's a tale of healing, bridging worlds, and finding belonging in the most unexpected places. Subscribe to our channel to begin today's story of resilience and redemption, and discover how a single haircut can change a life. Nathan tightened his worn jacket around his shoulders, burrowing deeper into the shadows of the abandoned storefront. Across the street, Riley's barber shop came to life with its familiar rituals. The morning sun illuminated the red, white, and blue stripes of the rotating barber pole, sending a kaleidoscope of colors across the pavement. For weeks now, this view had become Nathan's sanctuary. From his hidden corner, he had observed the steady rhythm of the shop, the predictable ebb and flow of its customers. Nathan clung to this routine as if it were a lifeline. It was a reminder that, even amidst the chaos of life, some things remained constant. Riley's barbershop was a world unto itself, a small universe of order and calm in the bustling heart of Chicago. Nathan watched it all unfold, unseen and unnoticed, as though he were a ghost. Each day brought its own cast of characters. In the early hours, the regulars arrived, older men with neatly combed hair and the ease of those who had long established their place in the world. They'd sit in Riley's chairs, swapping stories about the past, sharing jokes only they understood. Then came the lunch crowd, office workers in crisp shirts, juggling coffee cups and conversations as they tried to fit a trim into their tight schedules. By late afternoon, the shop filled with the afterwork crowd, weary professionals grateful to sink into Riley's comfortable leather chairs. Nathan knew their routines better than they did. He could predict, almost to the minute, when Mr. Conrad would arrive for his Thursday morning shave or when the young lawyer from the corner office would dash in, perpetually 5 minutes late. But it was Riley himself who captivated Nathan most. Riley moved with the effortless grace of someone who had mastered his craft. His scissors seemed to dance, slicing through hair with precision and care. His voice, low and even, could be heard murmuring to his clients, a steady rhythm of reassurance and conversation. Riley's presence exuded a quiet strength, the kind that drew people to him without him having to try. Every so often, his gaze would flick toward the window, catching Nathan's faint reflection. But Riley never stared. There was no judgment in his eyes, no curiosity, just a glance, brief and fleeting, like a whisper of acknowledgement. Nathan wasn't sure why he kept returning. Maybe it was the warmth he felt through the window, the golden glow of the barbershop lights spilling onto the cold street. Maybe it was the sense of belonging that emanated from within, a feeling he had long forgotten. Or maybe it was Riley himself, with his unspoken kindness and quiet understanding. One brisk morning, something broke the pattern. Riley stepped outside, holding a steaming cup of coffee. Nathan froze, his pulse quickening. Riley stood on the sidewalk for a moment, scanning the street as if looking for someone. Nathan instinctively shrank further into the shadows, ready to retreat. But Riley didn't call out. He didn't search. Instead, he bent down and placed the cup on the ground, right at the edge of the curb. Then, without a word, he turned and went back inside. Nathan stared at the cup, steam curling into the crisp morning air. The gesture caught him off guard. It was so casual, so unassuming, that he wasn't sure what to make of it. Riley hadn't looked around to see if Nathan would take it. He hadn't waited for acknowledgement or thanks. It was as if the coffee wasn't meant to obligate him, just an offering, a quiet signal that he had been seen. Nathan didn't move. He stayed rooted in his spot, watching the coffee grow cold as the hours passed. The next day, Riley did it again. This time, he lingered by the cup, his body language open, unthreatening. It's getting colder, he said, his voice carrying across the street. Coffee helps. Nathan's feet betrayed him before his mind could catch up. He found himself stepping out of the shadows, his body drawn toward the warmth that radiated from the shop. The smell of fresh coffee mingled with the comforting scent of aftershave and talcum powder. He stopped just short of the curb, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I don't have any money, he mumbled, his voice rough from disuse. Riley shrugged, his expression easy. Who's asking for money? I'm asking if you want coffee. And maybe, he added, gesturing gently toward Nathan's tangled hair and unkempt beard. A little cleanup. Free of charge. Nathan hesitated. The thought of stepping inside the barber shop, of sitting in one of those chairs, was almost too much to bear. He hadn't let anyone touch his hair in years, hadn't looked at his reflection in even longer. But there was something in Riley's tone, in the way he stood there, patient and unassuming, that made Nathan take another step forward. The warmth of the shop hit him like a wave, the rich wood-paneled walls and soft lighting making him feel both exposed and comforted. Riley guided him to a chair with the same care he showed his paying customers, treating Nathan not as an outsider but as a guest. As he sat, the mirrors reflected a version of himself he barely recognized. His hair hung in greasy ropes, his beard a wild tangle. He felt the weight of his own appearance, the years of neglect staring back at him. But Riley said nothing. He simply draped a cape over Nathan's shoulders and began his work. His scissors moved with the same quiet precision Nathan had observed from afar, each snip deliberate and sure. Riley's presence was steady, his movements practiced, creating a bubble of calm that insulated Nathan from the outside world. For the first time in years, Nathan felt something stir within him, something warm and fragile, like the first flicker of a flame in the cold. He wasn't sure if it was hope or just the comfort of being seen. But whatever it was, it kept him seated in that chair, trusting Riley's hands to transform not just his appearance, but something deeper. Something he hadn't dared hope for in a long time. The first snip of Riley's scissors sent a strange ripple through Nathan's chest, a mixture of apprehension and relief. He flinched at the sound, his hands gripping the leather armrests as if to anchor himself. Riley paused, his eyes meeting Nathan's in the mirror with quiet reassurance. We'll take it slow, Riley said softly, his voice steady and kind. Nathan nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. He felt the weight of the cape around his neck, the slight constriction adding to the surreal sensation of being so exposed. The hum of the shop filled his ears, the low buzz of clippers, the murmur of casual conversations, the occasional laughter of customers. It was a symphony of normalcy, one Nathan hadn't been part of in years. As Riley worked, layers of tangled, greasy hair began to fall away, drifting like dark feathers to the floor. Each pass of the scissors felt like the removal of something more than hair. The weight of neglect, of years spent hiding, seemed to lessen with every careful stroke. Riley moved with precision, his presence calm and grounding. Nathan closed his eyes, focusing on the rhythmic snipping sound, allowing himself to drift into the moment. But the mirrors reflected more than just his transformation. He couldn't help but catch glimpses of his emerging face, his features slowly revealed from beneath the mess. His jawline, sharp and angular, became visible again. His beard, which had grown wild and unruly, was trimmed with deliberate care. It had been so long since he'd truly looked at himself that he wasn't sure he recognized the man staring back. The other patrons had begun to notice. At first, their interest was subtle, fleeting glances and curious whispers. But as more of Nathan's face emerged, the energy in the shop shifted. Conversations quieted, magazines were lowered, and people started to watch more openly. Riley, ever attuned to his surroundings, subtly adjusted his stance, placing himself between Nathan and the growing stares. His movements were fluid, protective without being obvious. You remind me of someone, came a voice from the waiting area. Nathan's grip on the armrests tightened. The speaker was an elderly man, his weathered face etched with curiosity as he leaned forward, squinting. His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Nathan's heart began to race, a surge of panic rising in his chest. He could feel the weight of the man's gaze, as if it was peeling back the layers of anonymity Nathan had so carefully constructed. Riley didn't falter. His hands remained steady, guiding the clippers with practiced ease. "You know," he said, his tone casual and light, "these old photos always make me nostalgic." He gestured toward a wall of black and white photographs that adorned the shop. "Every face tells a story, doesn't it?" The elderly man was not so easily distracted. He leaned further forward, his cane gripped tightly in his hands. "It's the eyes," he murmured, almost to himself. "Something about those eyes." Nathan fought the urge to bolt from the chair. His knuckles turned white as he dug his fingers into the armrests. The cape around his neck felt suffocating now, like a trap holding him in place. Through the mirror, he caught sight of his own reflection, the face that had once been hidden now fully revealed. It was a face he hadn't wanted to see again, one that belonged to a different life, a different person. The buzz of the clippers was the only sound in the shop now, each pass revealing more of Nathan's true features. The other customers watched openly, their casual curiosity turning into something sharper. Nathan could hear their whispers, fragments of conversations that sent a chill down his spine. "Doesn't he look like? Could it be?" Riley worked quickly now, sensing Nathan's growing discomfort. His hands moved with purpose, finishing the cut with a calm efficiency that belied the tension in the room. But the damage was done. The fragile anonymity Nathan had clung to was slipping away, undone by the simple act of sitting in this chair. When Riley finally stepped back and removed the cape, Nathan felt exposed in a way he hadn't anticipated. The transformation was complete, his reflection in the mirror unrecognizable. He stared at the man before him, a man with sharp cheekbones, neatly trimmed hair, and a clean-shaven face. A man who looked like he belonged, even if Nathan didn't feel it. "You remind me of someone," the elderly man said again, more insistent this time. "A face I saw years ago, in the newspaper." "Maybe." Nathan's stomach churned. His past, buried beneath years of careful invisibility, now seemed to pulse just beneath the surface of his newly revealed skin. He could feel the weight of recognition growing in the room, the stares pressing against him like a physical force. Riley stepped forward, his calm voice cutting through the tension. "How does it feel?" he asked Nathan, brushing a few stray hairs from his shoulder. His question was simple, but his eyes held a deeper meaning, a quiet reassurance that Nathan wasn't alone in this moment. Nathan couldn't find the words to respond. His throat felt tight, his mind spinning. The weight of the room, of his reflection, of the whispers and stares, threatened to crush him. And yet, in the midst of the chaos, Riley's presence was a steadying force, a reminder that, despite everything, he was still here. For the first time in years, Nathan wasn't sure whether to feel terrified or hopeful. Maybe both. Nathan's heart pounded in his chest as he sat in the barber chair, staring at his reflection. The room seemed to close in on him, the walls pressing inward as the whispers around him grew louder. The elderly man's words echoed in his mind, "A face I saw years ago, in the newspaper." He gripped the chair's armrests tightly, his knuckles white. This was what he had been running from for years. The fear that someone would recognize him, that the carefully constructed invisibility he had cultivated on the streets would be ripped away. The barber shop, which had felt so safe moments ago, now felt like a trap. Riley, sensing Nathan's spiraling discomfort, moved to stand between him and the elderly man. "Let's give him some space," Riley said lightly, his tone calm but firm. With a few deft movements, he swept the fallen hair from the floor, creating a small physical barrier that felt symbolic, as if shielding Nathan from the curious stares. But it wasn't enough. Through the mirror, Nathan saw the others in the shop, customers pretending to flip through magazines while stealing glances at him. The woman near the window whispering to her companion. The young man in the corner typing furiously on his phone. It was all too much. The air seemed thick with recognition. As if everyone in the room knew something about him that he couldn't hide. The bell above the shop door jingled. And a young woman walked in. Clutching her phone. She paused just inside. Her gaze locking onto Nathan. Her expression shifted from casual curiosity to something sharper. More focused. Nathan's pulse quickened. He could see it in her eyes, recognition. She raised her phone. And before anyone could stop her, the flash went off, lighting up the shop with a sudden burst. Everyone jumped. And the woman's face turned red as she stammered. "Sorry. I didn't mean to," but her fingers were already moving across the screen. Likely sharing the photo with a caption or sending it to someone else. Nathan froze. His mind racing. He could see the ripples forming in his imagination, a photo spreading online. Whispers turning into a flood of comments. His face plastered on screens across the city. The thought made his stomach churn. Riley's voice broke through his haze. "Photography isn't allowed in the shop without permission," he said firmly. Stepping toward the woman. But she was already backing toward the door. Muttering apologies as she slipped out. The bell jingled again as the door closed behind her. Nathan's panic reached its peak. He couldn't sit there any longer. The chair felt suffocating. The mirrored walls reflecting too much of him. Too many versions of himself he didn't want to see. The elderly man's gaze was still on him. His brows furrowed in thought. And the whispers around the room were growing louder. "I need to go," Nathan mumbled. His voice shaking. Riley placed a steady hand on his shoulder. "Let's take a minute," he said softly, leaning down to meet Nathan's eye level. "You don't have to run." But Nathan didn't know how to stay. He was a man who had spent years perfecting the art of disappearing. The street had been his refuge. A place where no one expected anything from him. Where he could exist without questions or stares. Now, sitting here under the bright lights of the barber shop, with eyes boring into him, he felt stripped of that safety. Before Riley could say more, Nathan stood abruptly, the cape around his neck falling to the floor. He grabbed his jacket and muttered, "Thanks for the haircut," without meeting Riley's eyes. He felt Riley's hand drop away as he pushed past him, heading for the door. The cold air hit him like a slap as he stepped outside. The streets were bustling. The hum of city life a stark contrast to the oppressive quiet of the shop. Nathan shoved his hands deep into his pockets and walked quickly, his breath visible in the chill of the late afternoon. He didn't know where he was going, only that he needed to put as much distance as possible between himself and the barber shop. His mind raced as he replayed the last hour. The whispers. The recognition. The photo, it was all unraveling too quickly. He felt like a thread being pulled loose. The fabric of his anonymity tearing apart. He had spent years hiding. Avoiding mirrors and conversations. Building a life in the shadows. But now, with one haircut and one photograph, it felt as if his entire existence had been dragged into the light. As he turned a corner, he caught his reflection in a store window. He stopped abruptly, staring at the clean-shaven face looking back at him. It was startling. This version of himself. For years, he had let his beard grow wild, his hair fall unkempt, using his appearance as a shield. Now, without it, he felt exposed, vulnerable. But as he stared at his reflection, something else stirred within him, something unexpected. Beneath the fear and the panic, there was a flicker of pride. He looked different. Yes. But he didn't look broken. For the first time in years, he could see traces of the person he used to be, the person he had thought was lost forever. He reached up, touching his smooth cheek, feeling the unfamiliar texture of freshly trimmed hair. The gesture felt almost surreal, as if confirming that the person in the reflection was really him. Then the fear crept back in, sharp and insistent. He tore his gaze away and hurried down the street. his hands trembling in his pockets. He didn't know what would happen next. All he knew was that the walls he had built around his life were crumbling, and he wasn't sure if he could stop it. Nathan walked briskly through the streets, weaving between crowds, his thoughts spinning as fast as his feet moved. The freshly cut hair that had felt like a transformation now felt like a beacon, drawing eyes to him wherever he went. Every glance from a passerby sent his heart racing, each smartphone held up in the air feeling like a weapon pointed at him. He turned another corner, seeking refuge. But no matter where he went, the fear followed him. The streets that had once been his sanctuary now felt threatening, as if every shadow hid someone who might recognize him. He hadn't felt this exposed in years. For a decade, he had perfected the art of blending into the background. Worn clothes, an unkempt appearance, and a quiet demeanor all helped him stay invisible. But now, the sharp lines of his face, the neatly trimmed hair, and the absence of his scruffy beard made him unrecognizable even to himself. He turned down a narrow alley and slowed his pace. The muffled sounds of the city softened, giving way to the hum of a distant air conditioning unit and the soft trickle of water dripping from a gutter. Nathan leaned against a brick wall, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. What had he been thinking? Stepping into that barber shop? He had spent years crafting a life in the shadows, staying hidden, safe from the weight of his past. Now, with a single haircut, it felt as if that life was slipping through his fingers. He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a battered phone Riley had given him months ago. Just in case, Riley had said when he handed it over, his voice kind but firm. You never know when you might need it. Nathan rarely used it, keeping it off most of the time. But today, it was his lifeline. He stared at the screen, hesitating for a long moment before finally pressing the power button. It buzzed to life, and immediately, the notifications began flooding in. Missed calls, text messages, voicemails, all from Riley. Nathan hesitated before listening to the most recent voicemail. Riley's calm voice filled the silence. Nathan, it's me. Look, I know today was overwhelming, but I just want you to know, whatever you're feeling, you don't have to face it alone. The shop is always open for you. No pressure. Just, don't disappear. Okay? Nathan swallowed hard, the sincerity in Riley's voice cutting through the whirlwind of his thoughts. It was the first time in years that someone had spoken to him like that, with understanding, without expectation. But instead of comfort, it only deepened his sense of conflict. He shoved the phone back into his pocket, his hands trembling. His eyes scanned the alley, searching for familiarity. The city had always been his ally, a labyrinth he knew intimately. He had spent years navigating its streets, finding hidden corners where no one could bother him. But now, even these places felt unsafe. The barber shop had shaken something loose inside him, forcing him to confront the very things he had worked so hard to bury. Suddenly, a sound behind him made him spin around. A young man, another street dweller Nathan recognized from the shelters, emerged from the shadows. His clothes were ragged, his face worn but kind. Nathan, the man asked hesitantly. You okay? Nathan relaxed slightly, recognizing the man. Yeah, he muttered, running a hand through his hair. Just thinking. The young man tilted his head, studying Nathan for a moment. Heard about you, he said. Riley gave you a haircut. Right. Looks good. Nathan blinked, surprised. How do you know? The man shrugged. Word travels fast, especially around here. People notice when someone steps out of the shadows. Nathan frowned, unsure how to respond. He didn't want attention, didn't want to be noticed. And yet, the man's words held no judgment, only quiet admiration. As if Nathan's transformation was something to be celebrated. You should come back to the shelter tonight, the man added. They've been asking about you. Nathan shook his head. I'm not ready for that. The man didn't push, He simply nodded and patted Nathan's shoulder. "Well, if you change your mind, we're there." As the man disappeared back into the shadows, Nathan leaned against the wall again, his mind churning. The idea of returning to the shelter, of facing familiar faces with his new appearance, felt impossible. And yet, a small part of him, one he had tried to silence, wondered what it might feel like to be seen. Not just noticed, but truly seen. The thought lingered as he pushed off the wall and began walking again. The city stretched before him, its streets alive with possibility and danger. For the first time in years, Nathan didn't know where he was going, but he couldn't shake the feeling that, no matter where he ended up, something was beginning to change. Nathan wandered aimlessly through the streets, his mind a tangled mess of emotions. The freshly trimmed hair that had first felt alien now felt strangely comforting, as if it was nudging him toward something new, something he couldn't yet name. But alongside that flicker of possibility was fear, a deep, gnawing fear of being seen, of being known. He crossed into a quieter part of the city, where the buildings were older and the sidewalks cracked from years of wear. It was the kind of place where people didn't ask too many questions, where anonymity could still be found if you knew where to look. Nathan spotted a bench tucked under a street lamp, its light flickering intermittently, and sat down, the cool metal pressing against his back. The street was nearly empty, save for the occasional hum of a passing car. For the first time since leaving the barber shop, he allowed himself to breathe. His thoughts slowed, and he began to process the events of the day. The kindness in Riley's eyes, the way he had shielded Nathan from the curious stares, it lingered in his mind like a balm against the rawness of his fear. And then there was the young man in the alley, his simple words cutting through Nathan's defenses with quiet clarity. People notice when someone steps out of the shadows. Nathan pulled the phone from his pocket again, staring at it as if it held answers. He didn't dare turn it back on. The idea of more voicemails, more calls, was too overwhelming. Instead, he clutched it tightly in his hand, his thumb tracing the worn edges of the case. For years, he had built walls around himself, walls so high and so strong that not even the cold of winter or the hunger of empty nights could break through. But now, those walls felt paper-thin, ready to collapse under the weight of something he couldn't yet name. The sound of approaching footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. A woman walked past, her coat drawn tightly around her as the wind picked up. She glanced at him briefly, her expression unreadable. Before continuing on her way, Nathan watched her disappear around the corner, wondering what she saw when she looked at him. Did she see someone lost? Someone trying to belong? Or just another face in the crowd? He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, and stared at the pavement. His thoughts drifted to his family, to the life he had left behind so many years ago. He hadn't allowed himself to think of them in a long time, not his mother, with her constant attempts to fix him, nor his father, whose disapproval had been as sharp as a blade. Those memories had always been too painful, too suffocating. But now, sitting on this bench with the world quiet around him, they came flooding back. He remembered the last argument with his father, the way the older man's voice had risen in frustration. "Why can't you just pull yourself together? Nathan, do you know how hard we've worked for you? How much we've sacrificed?" His mother had stood nearby, her hands wringing nervously, her eyes pleading with him to say something, anything, that would calm the storm. But Nathan had stayed silent, the words trapped in his throat. That night, he had packed a bag and slipped out while the house was still. He hadn't looked back. For years, he told himself it was for the best, that leaving was the only way to breathe. But now, he wasn't so sure. What if they had changed? What if he had? The thought startled him. Could he go back? Could he face them after all this time? A gust of wind swept down the street, scattering a few leaves at his feet. Nathan stood abruptly, shoving the phone back into his pocket. He wasn't ready for those questions. Not yet. But as he began walking again, a quiet determination took root in his chest. He would return to Riley's shop. Not today. Maybe not even tomorrow. But soon. There was something there, something about Riley's steady presence. The way he treated Nathan as if he mattered. As if he belonged. It was something Nathan couldn't ignore. No matter how much his fear told him to run. As he disappeared into the night, the city stretched before him like an unspoken promise. For the first time in years, Nathan felt the faintest flicker of hope. Fragile but real. Pushing him forward. The following morning, Nathan found himself standing across from Riley's barber shop once again. The early sunlight cast long shadows across the pavement, and the striped barber pole spun lazily in the crisp air. He hadn't planned to come back so soon, but his feet had carried him here before his mind could argue otherwise. The shop's interior glowed warmly, its polished wood panels and soft lighting beckoning him like a sanctuary. Through the window, he could see Riley moving about, preparing for the day. He looked as calm and collected as ever, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Nathan hesitated, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets. What was he doing here? He had left yesterday in a whirlwind of panic, certain he would never return. Yet here he was, drawn back by something he couldn't quite name. Before he could talk himself out of it, the bell above the shop door jingled as Riley stepped outside. He held 2 steaming cups of coffee, his breath visible in the cool morning air. Spotting Nathan across the street, Riley raised one of the cups in a silent invitation. Nathan hesitated for only a moment before crossing over, his steps slow and measured. "Morning," Riley said, handing him the coffee. His voice was easy, as if Nathan's abrupt departure the day before hadn't left a mark. "Thought you might need this." Nathan took the cup, the warmth seeping into his chilled fingers. "Thanks," he muttered, his voice rough. He stared down at the coffee, unsure of what to say. They stood in silence for a moment, the bustle of the city just beginning to stir around them. Riley leaned against the doorframe, his expression relaxed. "You don't owe me an explanation. You know," he said, his tone gentle. "But if you want to talk, I'm here." Nathan looked up, surprised by the words. Riley wasn't pushing, wasn't demanding anything of him. It was a kindness Nathan wasn't used to, a space to simply exist without judgment. "I didn't mean to make a scene yesterday," Nathan began, his voice quiet. "It's just, being in there, with everyone staring, it was too much." Riley nodded, his gaze steady. "I get it. It can feel like the world's closing in on you sometimes." Nathan studied him, searching for any hint of pity, but there was none. Riley's words felt genuine, like he truly understood. Nathan took a sip of coffee, the bitter warmth grounding him. "For years, I've stayed invisible," Nathan admitted, his words coming slowly. "It's safer that way. People don't ask questions if they don't notice you." Riley nodded again, his face thoughtful. "But sometimes being noticed isn't a bad thing. Sometimes it means someone sees you for who you really are." Nathan frowned, his grip tightening on the cup. "What if I don't want to be seen? Then that's okay too," Riley said simply. "But hiding doesn't mean the world stops spinning. Sooner or later, it'll catch up to you." Nathan let those words hang in the air, their weight pressing against him. He thought of the elderly man in the shop, the whispers, the flash of the young woman's camera. The world had already started to notice him, whether he liked it or not. Riley glanced at the shop behind him. "You know, cutting hair isn't just about appearances," he said. "It's about giving people a moment to feel like themselves again, no matter what they're going through." Nathan's chest tightened at the words. He thought of the transformation he'd seen in the mirror the day before. The way Riley had worked so carefully, treating him with the same respect as any other customer. It had been more than just a haircut, it had been a reminder that he was still human, still deserving of care. "Come inside," Riley said after a moment, his voice calm. The shop's quiet this time of day. We don't even have to talk if you don't want to. Just sit for a while. Nathan hesitated, his feet rooted to the ground. The thought of stepping back into that space, of facing the mirrors and the memories, felt overwhelming. But there was something in Riley's expression, an unspoken promise of safety, of understanding, that made him nod. Riley pushed the door open, the familiar chime of the bell ringing out. Nathan followed him inside, the warmth of the shop enveloping him like a blanket. The chairs were empty, the air filled with the faint scent of aftershave and coffee. It felt quieter now, less like a stage and more like a refuge. Riley gestured to a chair near the window. "Sit," he said, his tone light. "You don't have to do anything else." Nathan sat down, his body tense at first. But as the minutes passed, he began to relax, the gentle hum of the shop soothing his frayed nerves. Riley moved around the room, preparing his tools for the day. But his presence was steady, a quiet reassurance that Nathan wasn't alone. For the first time in years, Nathan felt the smallest crack in the walls he had built around himself. He didn't know what would come next. But for now, he allowed himself to sit, to breathe, to be seen. Nathan sat near the window of Riley's barber shop, the warm sunlight streaming through the glass. The quiet hum of the room wrapped around him, softening the edges of his unease. Riley moved about, organizing his tools and wiping down the counters with an easy rhythm that felt oddly calming. There was no pressure, no demands, just a space where Nathan could simply exist. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Riley respected the silence, letting Nathan find his own way to the words he wanted to say. Nathan clutched the warm coffee cup in his hands, staring at the faint swirl of steam rising from it. He had forgotten what it felt like to just sit, to not constantly look over his shoulder or plan his next move. After a while, Riley broke the silence. "You've been watching the shop for a while, haven't you?" Nathan tensed, but Riley's tone was gentle, without accusation. He nodded slowly, not meeting Riley's eyes. "Yeah, for weeks, I guess." Riley leaned against the counter, his arms crossed casually. "What made you stop and stay?" Nathan hesitated. He wasn't used to sharing his thoughts, especially ones so raw and unguarded. But something about Riley's steady presence made it easier to speak. "I don't know," he admitted. "It was just the way things looked from the outside. Calm. Like everything made sense in here." Riley smiled faintly, his gaze thoughtful. Funny how things can look so put together from the outside. Inside, though, it's just as messy as anywhere else. We're all just figuring it out as we go. Nathan let the words sink in. He had always thought of Riley's shop as a haven, a place untouched by the chaos of the world. But maybe it was more than that, a place where people brought their messiness and found a way to make sense of it. If only for a little while. "I guess I thought," Nathan's voice faltered, and he stared down at his hands. "I guess I thought maybe I could feel that way, too. Even for a minute." Riley nodded, his expression warm. "You already did, Nathan. You came in yesterday. That was the first step." Nathan glanced at Riley, startled by the simplicity of his words. Could it really be that simple? Could just walking through the door mean something? After all these years of running and hiding? As if sensing his thoughts, Riley continued, "You know, I've had a lot of people come through this shop over the years. All kinds of stories, all kinds of struggles. And the one thing I've learned is that healing doesn't happen all at once. It happens in moments. Small choices that add up." Nathan swallowed hard, the weight of Riley's words settling in his chest. He thought about the choice he had made to walk into the shop yesterday. The choice to stay and let Riley cut away the layers he had hidden behind for so long. It had felt terrifying, like stepping into the light after years in the dark. But now, sitting here in the quiet warmth of the shop, he realized it had also felt good. The bell above the door jingled, and Nathan instinctively stiffened. A woman entered, her coat wrapped tightly around her as she held the hand of a small boy. Riley greeted her with his usual easy smile, guiding them to one of the chairs. The boy climbed into the seat, his legs swinging nervously as Riley began to talk him through the haircut. Nathan watched, fascinated by the way Riley put the child at ease, his movements calm and reassuring. The boy's mother sat nearby, her shoulders relaxing as she flipped through a magazine. It was such a simple scene, yet it stirred something in Nathan, a longing he hadn't realized was still there. He turned back to the window, his reflection faint in the glass. The clean-shaven face staring back at him looked like a stranger. But it also looked possible. A version of himself he hadn't dared to imagine in years. The boy's laughter broke through his thoughts, and Nathan found himself smiling faintly. He glanced over at Riley, who caught his eye and gave him a knowing nod, as if to say, "See, this is what it's about." For the first time in years, Nathan allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was a place for him here. Not just in the shop, but in the world outside its doors. A place where he didn't have to hide, where he could start to piece himself back together. Riley finished the boy's haircut with a flourish, holding up a mirror to show him the back. "What do you think?" he asked with a grin. The boy beamed. "I look awesome." Nathan couldn't help but chuckle under his breath. Riley glanced at him, his eyes crinkling with amusement. "You see," Riley said softly, "sometimes a little change makes all the difference." Nathan nodded, the faintest glimmer of hope stirring in his chest. Maybe he wasn't ready for all the answers yet, but he was starting to realize that, for the first time in a long time, he wanted to try. The shop grew busier as the morning progressed, filling with the steady rhythm of scissors, clippers, and quiet conversation. Nathan stayed by the window, watching it all unfold. Customers came and went, exchanging smiles and snippets of their lives with Riley. The air hummed with a sense of community, a kind of closeness Nathan hadn't felt in years. Despite his initial unease, Nathan found himself drawn into the flow of the shop. Riley's presence remained a constant, moving seamlessly between tasks, his calm demeanor setting the tone for everyone around him. There was something reassuring in the way Riley worked. As if every haircut was more than just a service, it was a small act of care. A reminder that everyone mattered. "Hey, Nathan," Riley called, pulling him out of his thoughts. "You mind helping me grab a few things from the back?" Nathan hesitated, caught off guard. "Me? Yeah. You," Riley said with a grin. "I could use an extra pair of hands. Unless you've got somewhere else to be." Nathan shook his head and stood, his movements tentative. He followed Riley to a small storage room in the back, cluttered with supplies, combs, bottles of aftershave, and stacks of towels neatly folded on shelves. Riley handed him a box filled with hair products. "Just bring this out front," Riley said, picking up another box himself. "And maybe help me restock the shelves, if you're up for it." Nathan nodded, unsure why he felt nervous about such a simple task. But as he carried the box out, placing it carefully on the counter, he realized something: Riley was giving him a way to belong. It wasn't a grand gesture or a dramatic moment. It was just a small, quiet opportunity to be part of something. As Nathan started organizing the shelves, Riley glanced over. "You're good at this," he said casually. Nathan huffed a quiet laugh. "It's just putting stuff on a shelf." "Still," Riley replied, his tone light. "Takes focus, attention to detail. Those are good skills to have." Nathan didn't know how to respond to that. He wasn't used to compliments, especially not ones that felt so genuine. He kept his focus on the task, but a faint warmth spread through him. When the shelves were stocked, Riley handed Nathan a broom. "Mind sweeping up a bit? Gets messy fast in here." Nathan took the broom without hesitation this time, falling into a rhythm as he swept the floor. He noticed the way customers glanced at him, some with curiosity, others with quiet approval. It wasn't the same as the stares from the day before, these were softer. Kinder. For the first time, Nathan didn't feel like he was being judged. He felt like he was part of the scene. As the afternoon wore on, Nathan became more comfortable moving around the shop. Riley's gentle encouragement gave him confidence, and the small tasks kept his hands busy, his mind less cluttered. He even caught himself chatting with a few of the customers, their conversations light and easy. An elderly woman with a kind smile caught his attention as he swept near her chair. "You're new here, aren't you?" she asked. Nathan nodded, unsure how much to say. "Kind of. Well, you're doing a fine job," she said warmly. "This place is lucky to have you." Her words took him by surprise, but he managed a quiet thank you. He felt a strange sense of pride in her approval, as if he was contributing to something bigger than himself. Later, as the shop quieted down again, Riley leaned against the counter, watching Nathan finish up. "You know," Riley began, "you've got a way with people. You ever thought about doing this kind of work?" Nathan froze, the broom pausing mid-sweep. "You mean, cutting hair?" "Yeah," Riley said, his tone casual but encouraging. "It's not just about the cutting. It's about connecting with people, helping them feel like themselves. I think you'd be good at it." Nathan blinked, caught off guard. "I don't know anything about it." "Not yet," Riley said with a shrug. "But everyone starts somewhere. If you're interested, I can teach you." Nathan hesitated, the idea both thrilling and terrifying. He glanced around the shop, at the neatly swept floor, the shelves he had just stocked, the chairs that had held so many stories. For the first time, he imagined himself here not as an outsider, but as part of it. "I'll think about it," Nathan said finally, his voice quiet but sincere. Riley smiled. "That's all I ask." As Nathan left the shop that evening, the streets felt different somehow. The city that had once seemed so overwhelming now felt a little less daunting. He didn't have all the answers, but he was beginning to see a path forward, one small step at a time. And for the first time in years, Nathan felt like he belonged, not just to the streets or to the shadows, but to something real, something that mattered. As Nathan walked out of Riley's barber shop, the cool evening air greeted him with a sense of renewal. For the first time in years, he felt like his life wasn't defined by the shadows he had lived in but by the possibilities ahead. He glanced back at the shop, the warm glow of its lights spilling onto the street, and smiled faintly. Riley had given him more than just a haircut, he had given him a chance to reconnect with the world, to see himself in a way he hadn't dared to before. Nathan wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing: he was ready to take the next step, no matter how small. Sometimes, change started with a single act of kindness. Thank you for watching Life Stories. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring tales of transformation and hope.